There we go. If I recall accurately, we were right here. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I believe we were right here on chapter 9, early republic. And I believe we had just finished the War of 1812, going over kind of the highlight issues there, the major points, which we just finished. And I think I was just about to go over Henry Clay when we hit 5 o'clock and we had to leave. So we're making good progress. We'll try to get through about a third of the slides here, which should take us to about chapter 18, 19, something like that. We'll see how it goes. So Henry Clay, good old Henry Clay. I always say is probably the greatest American politician who never became president and therefore is not on any of our money. He's hardly celebrated outside of his home state of Kentucky. And even there, I think most locals wouldn't even know who he was. Saved the American Republic on 3 separate occasions. He saved it in 18 with the Missouri Compromise. He saved it in 1833 over the nullification crisis, and he saved it in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850. Pretty impressive there. Yeah, sure. Someone's asking for the sign-in sheet. I'll drop it in one more time. So Henry Clay, incredible politician. He actually gets his start, his kind of first major foray into the international scene as he negotiates the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium, right after the War of 1812. He's there, and so is his sort of partner in crime, President's son and future President John Quincy Adams. And both of them in 1814 went to Belgium, and that kind of baptized them into the American political system. They become the major players for the decades afterwards in the 1820s and 30s, outside of Andrew Jackson, of course, John Calhoun. So I just dropped the sign-in sheet into the chat again. So if you just popped in, make sure that you go in and you sign in there, okay? So how does Clay fit into our story this particular time? Well, yeah, I am. Sorry, I don't have my secondary monitor. It's hard to go back and forth, so I'll try not to do this too much. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. So his American system, it's essentially a carbon copy of Hamilton's plan. Remember 1791, Hamilton said national internal improvements. That means infrastructure, like lighthouses, bridges, roads, things like that. Mostly it means harbors, because again, in the American system, a port or harbor is the property of the whole nation, and therefore they should take care of it. There's more resources to the country than to Long Beach, and so the country pays for the maintenance of Long Beach Harbor whenever we need to fix it up, because so many ships come in that affect the whole country. And so this was Clay's system, kind of a nationalist program, sort of inherited from the Federalist. But remember, the Federalist system, the Federalist Party anyway, will collapse after the War of 1812 because it was so pro-British, and in fact sold British bonds during the war, negotiated with the British in Canada for, cessation of hostilities. And so they were embarrassed at that, and the party just folded. After the 1815, you just have one political party, the Republican Party, Republican Party meaning Jefferson's party, Madison's party, Monroe's party. They would dominate, and it was weird. They absorbed the leftover Federalists, but they were all just within one party, just sort of separate wings of it. Kind of a weird time in American history, and this lasted a good 20 years until the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson so upsets everybody they create the Whig Party again. And Clay is, one of the founding fathers of the Whig Party, along with John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster. And he's calling for rechartering the national bank, internal improvements, and a protective tariff to protect industry in America. We have the new Lowell Mills in 1814, and this is Clay's American system. And again, it was sort of internally adopted by the Republicans who had been against it under Jefferson. Madison kind of saw the light. He just said, you know what? I'm not mad at the New Englanders. We have to kind of bring them back into the fold, and let's give them a say in the federal government. So as soon as Monroe gets elected in 1816, right after Madison steps down, he continues on with the Second National Bank. Madison had rechartered it his last year in office in 1816 for another 20-year charter. It would expire when Andrew Jackson's president, and we'll see how that ends up. And he charters a new bank. He supports a tariff. It's very weird. Madison, this quintessential Republican, starts to absorb these Federalist ideas. He also, Monroe, appointed a Federalist to be the most prestigious cabinet position, and that is Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams, leader of the Federalist Party, until it collapsed, is invited in, and he's able to achieve great success. He's probably our best Secretary of State ever. There's 4 treaties that he negotiates during this time, and they're a great success. There is the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817. This would solidify the border with Canada and formally make peace really after the Revolution, because one can look at the Revolution, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the Jay's Treaty in 1795, which solved most of those issues, but some still lingered with impressment and support of Tecumseh and Native American tribes. A War of 1812 was a second, conflict over these leftover issues. And then finally, the Treaty of Ghent, which John Quincy Adams helped sign in 1814. And then Rush-Bagot finally solidified everything and said, okay, here's the border, let's have permanent peace. We've just had the 200-year anniversary of this treaty. The US and Canada share the longest border in the world. It's over 3,000 miles long. It's got maritime boundaries, it's got land boundaries, there's immigration issues, there's trade issues. Not a blip in 200 years. No violations of the border, no wars. So John Quincy Adams did something right here. Pretty good. He also in 1819 signs the Adams-Onís Treaty, which is a treaty with Spain. Again, this imperial power in the Western Hemisphere. After the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, Spain didn't agree to that. And so we had to formalize the new borders between, Louisiana Territory and the rest of the Spanish Empire. We had some leverage over them because they were so heavily indebted. They owed $5 million to US banks. So this was easy for John Quincy Adams. He said, all right, we'll forgive all that money that you owe us. The US taxpayer will absorb that debt. And in exchange, you solidify the border with us. You agree we have Louisiana Territory, and throw in Florida while you're at it. So there we go. That's how the US acquires Florida. A lot of people imagine that Florida is one of the original 13 colonies. It was not. It was Spanish Florida until 1819. Why did the US want Florida? Well, it's got Disney World, of course, right? It's the best. No, that didn't exist in 1819. Of course, the sad reason the US wanted Florida more than anything was that it was a sanctuary for runaway slaves. And the Seminole Nation lived there. One of the last kind of places in the Western Hemisphere where Native Americans kind of ran their own lives, because there were just a couple of Spanish fortresses on the coast, St. Augustine, places like that. That was it. And because it was a refuge for runaway slaves, Southerners felt that gave comfort and solace to slaves. It was a threat because slaves would continuously rebel and try to run away if Florida was there. So if we could go in, clear out the sanctuary areas, re-enslave the runaways, the Maroons they were called, because they were marooned, outside of the US, and clear out the Seminole Nation, which Andrew Jackson dutifully did in 1819. After this acquisition, he was sent in by President Monroe, and he did what he was ordered to do. So what else did John Quincy Adams do? He made this treaty with Britain over the Oregon Territory. Remember that Oregon is very nebulous exactly who controlled it. A couple of competing claims. The Spanish said that they had it. The Russians said they had it. We said we had it. The British said we had it. And finally, we made an agreement with the British that said, you and us will formally control it. It'll be a condominium. That's a legal entity where there's sort of 2 owners. That process starts in 1823, I believe. And basically, we bluff the Russians and the Spanish and say, get out of this region. Spanish, you'll retreat into California. Russians, you'll retreat back up into Alaska. And this area that's British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, that territory is just called Oregon Territory. it becomes a condominium between the US and Britain. We will go back and demand we bisect it and cut it in half in the 1840s under President Polk, but for 20 years or so, it was this sort of joint ownership venture. Finally, John Quincy Adams penned the Monroe Doctrine, this doctrine that the Western Hemisphere is a zone of control of the United States. What had happened was Spain had just lost its empire essentially between 1810 and 1823. Spain lost pretty much every colony that it had except for the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. That was it. Everything on the mainland, Mexico through to Chile, was lost to them in a wave of revolutions. And amazingly, Europeans that were not Spanish felt bad about it. Sorry, I just realized my laptop because my AC adapter is like not quite plugged in. There it goes. Okay. So Europeans felt bad for the Spanish, meaning the French felt bad, the British felt bad, other countries felt bad and said, this is dangerous to our interests. The British felt that this wave of revolution started by America, continued by Haiti, and now every Latin American country would spur on further revolutions in Canada and all these other colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And the rightful place of American people, that is people in the Western Hemisphere, is to be colonists dominated by Europeans. And so Europeans issued this warning in 1823 to the Western Hemisphere saying, all of you independent nations, this is temporary. We, the European powers that control the globe, we're telling you we're coming for you again. We're going to redominate you. And the US decided we had to issue a statement back as sort of the leader of this hemisphere. We were the first independent nation in this hemisphere. And so we told Europe in the Monroe Doctrine, back off. Do not seek to reacquire any of these territories. Don't try to invade us. Don't try to invade our neighbors. Any European country that tries to attack, invade, conquer the Western Hemisphere countries, any of them, it will mean war with the US. Now, it was a bluff. We weren't prepared to defend Argentina or, even Mexico against a reinvasion, but we felt we had to enunciate this. Now, again, it's a bit of a joke at the beginning. Europeans just sort of chuckle, oh no, we're afraid of the Americans. It's not a joke anymore. Any country outside this hemisphere knows they best dang well stay out of our business over here because this is, quote, our backyard, the American sphere of influence. So that's where the Monroe Doctrine comes from. So what else happens during Monroe's presidency? Well, it's known as the era of good feelings because we only had one party at the time, but the good feelings were not entirely there all the time. We had a major economic recession, the first really in our history since independence. We had some hyperinflation in the 1780s, but not a decrease in employment or production. In 1819, there was a big snap of the economy because of overinvestment in land. There was so much land in the West after the acquisition of lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, and then the Louisiana Territory all the way to the Rockies. All of this land would be sold by the federal government to Eastern banks. They went on a feeding frenzy, just buying up land and bidding it up, kind of like how California real estate is right now. And it just drove prices sky high, finally to the point where farmers said, prices are as high here as they are in Europe. This is insane. We're not going to borrow anymore. Prices didn't rise anymore. There was sort of a ballooning effect that then popped. And then there was a collapsing of land prices, and then all kinds of, farming staples, price of corn collapsed, cotton, all of it. Now, when you read about recessions in the 19th century, understand that they are mitigated, they're minimized by the fact that most of us are still agricultural, that as bad as the economy might be, most Americans own their own land or at least worked, for someone who owned their own land. And you would always be able to dig a well to get water and raise enough food to feed yourself. And so it's not like today where if you lose your job, you need to get some government assistance or you starve to death, because none of us grow our own food anymore. And so I don't want to oversell it, even though there was a recession and farmers whine and complain quite a bit during this time. It hurts their pocketbook, but not so much, their existence. So this is the Panic of 18. Probably worse, I would argue, was the issue about Missouri. This was a huge crisis that very nearly led us to civil war very early on. A lot of people forget about 1820. It was a pretty difficult year. So here is what happens. It's a very difficult and tricky issue, but essentially there was a delicate balance during this time to balance out, because states are entities that have rights and have equal representation in the Senate, and the different sections have different interests. There was a determined effort to say, let's add states in pairs. We'll add Kentucky, and then we'll have to add Ohio to balance it out, one free, one slave. And this continued. Now, it makes things very difficult that the North is more heavily populated. Immigrants will almost exclusively go to northern states because that's where the jobs are, where industrialization is most felt. And just, the birth rate and, the population was just higher in these places because the South is more rural and doesn't have really big cities outside of a few, right? New Orleans, Atlanta, Charleston, South Carolina. But this is not New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, even Cleveland and Pittsburgh were bigger than any of those cities in the South. And so you had to add in pairs in order to kind of have equality and make sure, both sections were represented. Now, what really will mess this up is Missouri. Missouri in 1819 has the population to become a state because it had been a French colony for a long time. St. Louis, if you don't know, it's a very difficult city today, a lot of crime, a lot of poverty, but it was a major strategic area in the 18th, 19th centuries. It's right at the confluence of three major rivers. It's right where the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Missouri all flow right into each other. It's a vital strategic area to have. It's the gateway to the West, they called it. That's why the arch is there. And so it had been heavily populated ever since the French had been there, when it was the French Crescent. And the French allowed slavery to exist there. So there were already cotton plantations there when the US acquired it in 1803 in the Louisiana Purchase. What to do? Northerners just felt, well, we don't really have a say in it. The federal government controls the territories, but it would be quite something just for the federal government to legislate and say, hey, no slavery in Missouri at all. There were hundreds, thousands of landowners, slave owners. They would have raised hell if you had freed all their slaves. Northerners were a little reticent to do that, but they were thinking about it. Maybe we'd like to have a say. France was the one that decided that there would be slavery there. Why can't we have this discussion now? Southerners wanted to keep it. And there was a big conflict over this, political at the time. It didn't quite emerge into actual military conflict, but we were deadlocked and nobody knew exactly how to solve this. We were 11-11 in the Senate in terms of states, which means 22-22 in terms of senators. And in the House, you could get certain amendments passed, like the Talmadge Amendment. James Talmadge was a congressman from Pennsylvania, a Democrat, actually. But he just felt that slavery was a backward system. Again, the Northern attitude, not terribly radical. It's not like we want to ban slavery in the South where it exists in states where it already exists, because that's states' rights. You can't tell a state what to do. But what about in territories? We should be able to stop the spread of this awful institution anywhere else. And so he proposed this amendment, the Talmadge Amendment, which said slavery would be allowed in Missouri to enter the Union, but there would be a phasing in period of emancipation over 10, 20 years, something like that. Basically, every person born in Missouri after the adoption of the Talmadge Amendment would be a free person. So anyone enslaved already would stay enslaved, but their children would be free. So 40 years or so, there would be no slavery there. Well, this was the end of the world for South Carolina and several other states. They just felt that this would establish a precedent where Congress could tell states that they had to free their slaves. Well, that's not the case, but as territories enter the United States, why couldn't you put some kind of preconditions on them? It just seems logical. They're territories, you can boss them around. You just say, all right, you can become a state, but here's the preconditions. South just lost their mind. The Talmadge Amendment passes the House. It deadlocks in the Senate, 22-22. It cannot get passed, and no one wants to budge on this issue. Northerners say this is the pre-requirement for becoming a state. Southerners say no. If you block the admission of Missouri, there will be disunion and civil war. And we were just at a standstill. It looked very bad. It looked like South Carolina might secede. It looked like there might be a confederacy of southern states, and neither side was willing to budge. Both sides kind of dug in their heels, calling the others bluff, essentially. And so finally, Henry Clay comes in and brokers this agreement known as the Missouri Compromise. And here's how it works. Missouri would be allowed into the Union, no strings attached. We don't tell them they have to get rid of slavery within any amount of time. They make that determination. But the problem of Louisiana was that it was so unpredictable. Like, what do we do with the rest of it, right? Like, is it going to come in haphazardly without any plan? That was the issue with Missouri. It just sort of had been decided by an accident of fate. The French were there. And so Henry Clay establishes this 3630 line. We're going to have a latitude line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. It's the southern border of Missouri. You just cut straight due west across to the Rocky Mountains, where that was the edge of the US at the time. Everything south of that line would be slave territory. Essentially, that's only Oklahoma. North of that line, it would be multiple free states. So this would be Kansas, Nebraska, both Dakotas, Montana, Colorado. I'm probably missing a couple of states in there because it's the Midwest. Who cares, right? It's all just a cornfield anyway. And so that would be most of the compromise. It was still not good to Northerners. Northerners just said, well, now it'll be 12 to 11 in the Senate. And even though the South represents only a third of the population of this country, they will control a majority of the Senate. That's just not democracy. That's crazy. And so Clay said, all right, here's what we'll do. He goes to Daniel Webster. He goes to John Quincy Adams and said, along with the 3630 line and you getting most of Louisiana to free territory, we're going to cut Massachusetts in two to create a new free state. It's this weird situation from the colonial times when Maine was a district within Massachusetts, even though they're not geographically connected and contiguous. We had to get Massachusetts to consent to this, and they reluctantly did. Henry Clay saves the Union. Good job, Henry Clay. So that's the Missouri Compromise. Yay. Okay, let's go to slide 10, but I noticed a handful of you just came in. So if you came in and did not sign in, here's the sign-in sheet again. Go ahead and log on there. Thank you, and we'll get right back to it. Dang it, my AC adapter is still having issues here. Sorry, hang on a second. Probably won't die in the 2 hours, but I don't want my battery to get low. There we go. Okay. So moving into chapter 10. So slavery, a huge, huge part of this country's history. I would be very surprised if slavery doesn't appear at least somewhere on the AP test, probably in both like the writing section and the multiple choice section, but definitely at least in the multiple choice. Oh yeah, sure. Sorry. Someone was asking about the closed captioning. I forgot about that. There we go. Okay. Slavery, huge part of our history. It's how the wealth of our nation was created through cash crops. Remember that Northerners touted their superior economy. In many ways, it was a superior economy, but Americans were making pretty low quality products at this particular time. We were the upstart nation. We didn't have the resources or the population or the technology that France or Britain or Holland or Germany had. And we felt that we needed a tariff to protect those northern industries because no one outside of the US would buy any of our products because they were inferior. They were more expensive and lower quality. So the tariff was there. This was a huge divisive issue. Southern cotton was the best in the world. Okay, kind of today everybody is gaga over Egyptian cotton or Indian cotton. And South Carolina cotton, Virginia cotton, Mississippi cotton was the best in the world, and it was the lifeblood of the global economy. It sounds weird, but it's very true. About 20 years ago, there was a historian that wrote a very long book about the history of salt, which it just sounds like, what a boring book. But when you actually read the book, salt was 1,000 years ago the heart of the global economy. It was about the only seasoning that existed in Europe. Europeans are known for their bland food. They hadn't been introduced to all the peppers and spices of Southeast Asia. So they use salt. So it's a universal seasoning. It melts ice and snow. It cauterizes wounds. It's pretty painful, but you can use it to do that. It was a sign of civilization. It's not anymore, clearly. It's one of the cheapest commodities one can buy, just like sugar ran the global economy 200 years ago and, 300 years ago, I suppose, in the 1700s. In the 1800s, it was cotton, because the Industrial Revolution starts with textiles, and you need a steady supply of raw cotton to churn out all your finished fabrics. And so this fuels slavery even more than tobacco did in the 1700s. The cotton boom really starts in the late 18 teens, early 1820s, much longer than we imagine. We imagine like 1850s, right before the Civil War. No, several decades before. It was the number one export from the US to the rest of the world. It represented about 2/3 of all export dollars. Like I said, no one outside of the country wanted to buy our manufactured goods, but everybody wanted to buy our cotton. You could sell cotton to Northerners in the Lowell Mills, and then you could sell it to mostly to Britain, mostly to just one county in Britain, Lancashire, where all the factories were. That's Liverpool, Manchester, that region. And so slavery paid. It was just dollars and cents. It was a very profitable system to a handful of white landowners in the South, and so they wanted to perpetuate and keep that system. Now, the conditions that allow it to really latch on and thrive, because in all honesty, most people believe that slavery was a dying institution at the time of the Revolution. People predicted it would be gone in just a matter of decades, kind of like how we're predicting now that in another 50 years, you probably won't find a gasoline-powered car anymore, and that these renewables and electric cars are going to replace the internal combustion engine, and you can see it happening already. That trend has been going on quite some time. Likewise, in the 1790s, the price of cotton and the price of slaves was dwindling. It was getting to the point where if cotton prices plummeted even further, slave owners could not afford to actually take care, meaning feed and clothe and equip their slaves. So they would probably have to free them at some point and offer them some sort of sharecropping agreement or something, which is not great, but much better than slavery. And that is exactly what happens in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, with cotton and everything. The last couple of countries to abolish slavery are Brazil in 1888 and Spain and Cuba in 1890. And it's because the price of cotton and sugar and everything got so low that they had no choice. It wasn't some humanitarian thing like we have to free our slaves. It was just an economical calculation. The opposite trend was being reversed in the early 1800s. In the 1790s, the trend was going down. Prices of cotton, prices of land, prices of slaves was all on the decline. And if you read the slave owners at the time, they all kind of agreed to that. Monroe, Madison, Washington, Jefferson, they all said, we don't like slavery. We think it's not a very fitting system for a free democratic republic. It's unfortunate and embarrasses America on the national stage. But how do we do it? There were great fears about either the collapse of the Southern economy or that slaves would want to take revenge, probably understandably so, on their former masters. So no one really knew how to deal with it. Now, some people experimented with some weird ideas like the American Colonization Society, right? Like maybe we will offer the slaves, induce them to freedom, right? We will offer you your freedom, but you got to leave the country. We're going to buy land in Latin America or in Africa for you, and you'll be recolonized back whence you came. It turns out African Americans did not like that idea at all. They universally said, well, we're not African. We've been in this country 200 years, since 1619. We are American. We're Protestant. We speak English. We're not leaving. This is Virginia is our home, not Liberia. But nonetheless, people were at least thinking about the dismantling of this system. And then the cotton boom happened in the late 18 teens, early 1820s. A number of factors kind of intertwined to make slavery very profitable again. The first was land. It was very unsafe as a slave owner in Virginia in 1801 to travel west to Mississippi or Tennessee, because that land was controlled by Native American tribes that would not allow you to move there. After the War of 1812, it was pretty easy. So land was abundant and cheap for slave owners to move there. Second is that the Industrial Revolution had just kicked off in America. In 1814, the Lowell Mills opened, and every year demand increased for cotton. So northern factories needed it, and southerners said, we can supply it. And this is our one commodity that we can run a whole economy on. And so because of this, and also because of the shutting down of the Atlantic slave trade in a weird way made slavery almost more profitable because there was a lower supply of slaves. No more would be brought over after 1808. Congress legislates the end, some progress of a kind, of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. And so right at that time, there's a big demand for slaves and land and cotton. And so prices just skyrocket for all of those things. And so Southerners who, very strangely, were sort of apologetic about slavery in the 1790s and said, we know, you don't have to remind us that this is the ugly institution, the peculiar institution. It was always called peculiar because everything was about freedom in America. We had the most literate society on earth. We had the most newspapers per capita on earth. We had the best educational system on earth. The biggest electorate, more people could vote in America per capita and total numbers than anywhere else on earth. But this one institution, anyone, a child could point to it and say, but that ain't freedom. That's a really vile, disgusting old legacy of imperialism, and it's got to be gotten rid of. And Southerners stopped saying, we understand, we know, and they started saying, wait a minute, what's wrong with this system? It's better, because it was so profitable. It's better than the free market capitalism of the North. So you start to see a real change in the rhetoric and the tone of Southerners. They get very belligerent. They start saying, we're not going to allow slavery to be banned in the Western areas like we did in 1787 in the Northwest Territories, or even in 1820 with 3630. Industrial capitalism isn't blameless. There's lots of Catholic immigrants that come in the country. There's crime, there's riots, there's violence, there's theft. Don't kid yourselves, the rhetoric would go, that the lords of the lash are no worse than the lords of the loom. This phrase was used, right? That these textile mill owners were just as tyrannical as slave owners. I certainly object to that, but this is what Southerners said at the time. And they got very belligerent about this institution because it was paying so much. Now, this is the moment when most slaves are forcibly converted. For a long time, slave owners resisted it. Now, there was some conversion during the First Great Awakening, but a lot of slave owners were afraid to convert all of their slaves because one of the great tenets of Christianity is equality. Okay, it's kind of strange, but the Bible has got it's 66 separate books together, so there's different perspectives on stuff. But in some passages in the Old Testament, it seems to condone slavery in the ancient, Israelite system. But in the New Testament, if you read it, there's a lot of condemnations against slavery. Slavery's bad, slavery's wicked, etc. And so that was a fear that slave owners had. We don't want slaves to actually know that, Jesus and others condemned slavery. We don't want whites to see blacks as their equal as a Christian, as someone who has a soul, as someone who's redeemable, as someone, who can receive wisdom from God. And so that was resisted for quite some time, until finally the Second Great Awakening blew up real big in the 1830s and 40s. And it convinced a lot of slave owners that, well, maybe this would be better. Slaves would no longer feel like outsiders in a community. They would be in the same church as us. We would allow black men to be preachers, and that would allow them to have a certain degree of autonomy. They'd be less likely to rebel. And the main reason is that there's other portions of the New Testament that say, you shouldn't rebel against the, terrestrial orders. There's a lot in the New Testament about suffering in this world is okay because in the next world you'll be rewarded. And it was thought that slaves would make them more docile if you converted them. It certainly did not. In fact, there were a number of revolts in the early 19th century. There are slave revolts in the colonial period. There's slave revolts all through the Revolutionary period, and there's slave revolts for decades afterwards. The culprit was slavery. Okay, so still to this day, there's textbooks that kind of minimize this and say, slaves weren't all that unhappy. They whistled while they worked, etc. All this, toxic, humiliating stuff. For the most part, and in America, that history's been rewritten, is what we see it as being more accurate. But in other places, that stereotype still exists. We know it to be false because there were revolts. There were revolts all during this period. Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, all during this area. All right. Yeah, so Logan asked about Stono. That's Stono is 1730, I want to say. It's the colonial period, though. The colonial period, you have slave revolts in New York City. You had slave revolts in Natchez, Mississippi, when it was under the French Crescent in the 1720s. You had Stono, I think Stono is 1730 or 39, something like that. That's all during the colonial period. These three that I just mentioned, Denmark Vesey is 1822, I believe. Gabriel Prosser is 1800. Nat Turner, the granddaddy of them all, is 1831. 1831, bad year for the South. You have the largest slave revolt in American history. Nat Turner was a slave, and he led a rather brutal uprising where something about like 60 whites were murdered, where he murdered his master, slit his throat while he slept, went out to, the weapons cabinet, armed the slaves on the plantation. They murdered all the whites there. Then they moved on to the neighbor's plantation. And this was supposed to be a big snowballing, spiraling. It was the worst nightmare of every white Southerner, right? A lot of white Southerners looked around and said, gosh, in this county, we're outnumbered. What if the slaves had a day where they just controlled the show? We would all be killed. And that was seeming to come true in 1831. Now, it's put down as a revolt, but it makes the South unbelievably paranoid after this. You see this sort of wave of legislation that comes right after Nat Turner. You have laws that say you can't teach a slave to read or write, that you can't manumit your slave, where it's very odd, but you used to be able to free your slaves. In fact, I have a senior that's graduating this year. She was a student of mine last year. And her family owns an island in South Carolina. And I was asking her, I said, how did this happen? When did your family acquire it? And she said it was actually during slavery times that I think it was great-great-great-great-grandfather, like in the 1840s, was able to obtain his freedom and actually buy and own land, which is, you think, wow, that's kind of crazy. There were free blacks in South Carolina that could actually be landowners at that time. The numbers were quite small, and it was always up to the slave owner whether to free a slave. And you could free a slave for a long time. You have stories like that of free blacks who were shopkeepers or landowners, but the numbers were quite small, especially in the South. In the North, there was pretty sizable free black population. But after 1831, pretty much every Southern state says no more manumissions. You cannot free any more slaves, because that would mean more and more of the black population would be free, able to plan, have freedom of movement. And the feeling was that it wasn't slavery itself that was the problem. It was, get this, Yankees in the North who were outside agitators. And, 1831 is the year abolitionism starts. So William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator, and Southerners check it out and say, well, this is just a libel. It's an attack on the South. We got to get rid of this literature because it's dangerous. And so they ban all of this literature. They make the post office post the names of everybody in the window who's getting a copy of The Liberator, so lynch mobs can intimidate them. And the idea is that free blacks in the South are jealous of slaves and want to convince them to rebel, and sort of twist their minds, right? You don't love your mean old master, you want to murder him, right? And Southerners react this way to Nat Turner. Instead of looking at the situation, looking at themselves and saying, maybe we need to get rid of slavery, that's the issue. They say, no, it's abolitionist literature and it's the number of free blacks in our states. A lot of states say you have 1 year to get out. In 1831, most Southern states passed these laws. Virginia did, South Carolina did, and they said you have 1 year to get out. In retaliation for this, several Northwestern states passed similar ordinances, right? Illinois feels, well, there's going to be a mass exodus out of the South of black people. We don't want them to come to our state. You may not come to Illinois. Illinois, probably an unconstitutional law, even under slavery times, to not allow the freedom of movement of people into their state of free citizens. So little lesson that it's not that the North is not racist or anti-racist. They're just kind of different style of racism, one might say. So you got Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. You've got the Liberator coming out in 1831. And then the British are going to ban slavery in the Caribbean that year as well. And that was a warning sign. Nowadays, Parliament votes to do something. We all ignore it because who cares, right? Britain, I love them, but they are our junior partner in foreign policy. We tell them what to do now. It was the opposite in the 1830s. They had greater population. They ran the world effectively. And everyone looked to Britain as it happens there first, and then it'll spread to the rest of the world. France had already abolished slavery in 1790s. All the Latin American countries did too, except for Brazil. Everybody else freed their slaves in Mexico, Chile, Argentina. And so everyone looked at that, and Southerners said, well, this will create immense pressure on the Yankees to start telling us we need to free our slaves. This is dangerous. Our slaves are rebelling. Abolitionist literature is flooding into our state, and the British are moving in that direction too. This is truly problematical. So they get very, very invested in slavery. They defend it more and more and more. They entrench it. A system, like I said, that was dying in the 1790s is now given a new lease on life. So lots of revolts at the time, but slavery itself would get worse and worse and worse, meaning that standard of living of slaves would decline despite the fact that cotton prices are going up. All the benefits would go to the master rather than the slave. And so this system became even more brutal as you had to meet quotas in production. We have X number of cotton bales to produce every week. We got to work overtime. Slaves don't make any more money no matter how harder they work. And so masters would just work slaves harder and harder and harder every year. Okay, slavery got worse as an institution, not better. Okay, so chapter 11, Age of Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is one of these people in American politics that's sort of like a force of nature. He's our first sort of popular president. He's the first president that's popularly elected by the people. Remember that our Constitution, written in 1788, would not be a very progressive constitution today. If you wrote that same constitution as it was written in 1787 and you wrote it today for some other country, you would say, well, this is not a democracy. Right, it's estimated probably only about 8% of the US population was technically voting at this time. Slaves couldn't vote, that's about 20% of the US population. 50% were women, they couldn't vote. Native Americans couldn't vote. People under 21 couldn't vote. And even regardless of voting restrictions, the country had slavery, et cetera, et cetera. And so some progress is made in the 1820s by states starting to say, we used to have this method via the Electoral College where we just let the government of our state choose. Basically, state legislatures just said, who do we want to cast our electoral votes? States get sort of a static amount of electoral votes based on their senators plus reps. So California has 55. If this was like 1810, California elected officials would just meet in a closed room somewhere and say, whom do we want to give our 55 votes to? Do we want to give them to Trump or do we want to give them to Biden? That's not how any state runs it today. You have a popular election where citizens vote on that, and then they're given as a block to either candidate. It's a far more democratic model. Some states are talking about taking that back because some state governments didn't like how the last election went, and they want to change it where explicitly the law will say, well, what if the people vote in a way that we don't like? Can the government of our state overturn and award our electoral votes to the opposite candidate from the popular vote? I think this is a huge mistake and not a good idea, but some states are talking about it. But that was what our country was in the 18 teens. There were no popular elections. And then all of a sudden in the 1820s, there was sort of a small d democratic explosion of ideas. Remember, democratic or democracy was not a word the founding fathers used in any positive sense. They called us a republic. They didn't even use the term nation. Nobody used the term nation until Lincoln did in 1863. America was a republic, and democracy was always a pejorative. It meant Shays' Rebellion. It meant small people thinking they're big stuff and just taking the law into their own hands, ruled by the mob, right? And a lot of the founding fathers didn't like some of the shenanigans of the revolution, tarring and feathering and demolishing the governor of Massachusetts' house. They didn't like that stuff. They thought it was really uncouth, low class, and they thought most Americans were that way. We imagine the founding fathers love the average person. No, they were kind of snobs. Even Jefferson was, certainly Hamilton was. And so they did not have universal suffrage. No state did. Okay, the only state that came close was Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania allowed every free white male to vote upon getting independence in 1776. Black men would be able to vote several decades down the road, but women couldn't vote, et cetera, et cetera. So finally in the 1820s, there began to be a movement like Pennsylvania's that said free white men can vote. In most states, you had to own property, taxable over a certain amount, right? You had to have X number of assets that went to the government. It was felt if you don't pay taxes, you're poor, you don't deserve a say in the government. You're not an important person. This changed. Credit Jackson for at least this, that democracy became a, quote, good idea, that the people are wise, that the aggregate of decisions and opinions out there is the true wisdom and the general will, in kind of a Jean-Jacques Rousseau sense. And we should follow what that wisdom is. And so 1828 is the first election where you actually see what the popular vote was. There was no popular vote before then. Okay? We had numerous presidents where citizens didn't actually have any say in it, indirectly. Jackson has one last election before 1828 and 1824 where he loses. Jackson, quick history on him. Remember, he's born in 1767 in South Carolina. He joins the Revolutionary War in 1780 at the age of 13. He's captured and tortured by the British. He stays on in the military. He loses his life's fortune in the 1790s, loaning money to these British bankers who invest very unwisely. So he has a grudge against bankers and the British. He fights in the War of 1812 and wins at the Battle of New Orleans. He invades Florida and, gets this moniker as an Indian fighter. He had done the same thing in the War of 1812. And finally, he gets into politics in the late 18 teens and early 1820s. He's governor of Tennessee, and people loved him. He was a very popular, populist kind of president. The average Joe adored Andrew Jackson. Kind of this weird poll question we all get now that I think is stupid, but which of the two candidates would you rather have a beer with, right? Would you rather have a beer with Trump or Biden? It's like, why are people voting about who they'd rather have a beer with? This is stupid. But, such is the nature of American politics. We ask these kind of questions. And people like to identify with the people that rule over them. They don't want people who they think are, snobbish or look down on them or are better educated than them. They say, I want someone in government who's like me. And Jackson was certainly that. Very rough around the edges, not very well educated. He was no dummy, but, in these elections, John Quincy Adams would leak out, private letters that he found of Andrew Jackson's, and he misspelled everything. Jackson couldn't spell anything because he was uncultured, but most Americans couldn't spell very well, and they didn't think it was a big deal. Adams and Clay thought it was hilarious. They thought, this dum-dum can't be president. He can't spell anything. Doesn't matter. Turns out Americans don't really care if you can't spell. And so Jackson feels betrayed in 1824 because the election he feels was stolen from him. It's a four-way race, really three-way. It is three candidates were the major ones. So you have Andrew Jackson gets more votes than anyone else, but it's not a majority. Then Clay and Adams come in, second and third. It seems like if Clay and Adams can combine their support together, they would win, but that's not how the Electoral College works. But when it's thrown into the House, it kind of works that way by proxy. Basically, the election was disputed. The House of Representatives had to vote to solve it. And Clay says, I want my supporters to throw their support behind Adams. Adams will become the president, and then he'll name me Secretary of State. Jackson felt completely betrayed, and he called this the corrupt bargain, that the election was stolen from him. In fact, he told all of his friends and followers, I should challenge Henry Clay to a duel. Why he never wanted to challenge John Quincy Adams, I don't know why. Maybe he had more respect for him. It's not clear, but he hated Henry Clay for this and said he betrayed me. He stole the election. He stole the election, not even from me, from the American people. How dare you? Also, information about Jackson being married to two different women at the same time was leaked right before the election. Turns out it was true. Rachel's wife, Jackson, was married to someone else, years before and never divorced her husband, just ran away with Andrew Jackson. This is leaked right before the election. And coincidentally, Rachel Jackson dies of a heart attack right on the verge of her husband becoming president. So Jackson blames Henry Clay for murdering his wife. It's quite personal. He gets in there and he governs like a guy with a chip on his shoulder. He vetoed more laws, more bills than all other presidents combined. Very antagonistic and not very cultured or civilized. Like most people in government felt, well, you have to appoint a cabinet. That's the Constitution, and your advisors, advise you. They have to be cleared by the Senate. That's in the Constitution. Jackson said, you know what? I'm going to bring my friends from Tennessee back in the day. They won't be in the cabinet because, these guys frankly can't pass Senate confirmation, but I trust them more than anyone. And who says that they can't just sit in on meetings? They'll just live in the White House with me and they'll be my informal advisors. After the formal meeting, all the Senate confirmed people will leave, and then the guys I trust will stay behind, we'll play poker, drink whiskey, and they'll tell me what to do. This seemed very uncouth to a lot of people and kind of skirting on, becoming somewhat of a dictatorship where who really holds the power? The people that nobody elected? Jackson did this kind of stuff all the time. Think about when he liquidated the bank, he just gave all the government's assets to his best friends so they can enrich themselves. So Jackson's greatest moment is the nullification crisis. He had a lot of low moments in his presidency, but he did save the Union in its hour of crisis. To get reelected in 1832, he listened to his Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren, who told him that he needed a tariff, that it was clear the South and West would vote for Jackson in 1828, or sorry, in 1832. He was running for re-election at that time. It's clear that the South and West would vote for Jackson, and the Northeast would definitely go for Henry Clay in that election, the Whig candidate. The big question was the middle states of New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Who would win those states? And they're big manufacturing states. New York City and Pennsylvania make up a disproportionate population there. If you could get enough factory workers that make tables and chairs and textiles and stuff like that, protect their industries with a tariff, they might vote for you. A lot of people like you, but they don't like some of these policies, right? Your whole mantra seems to be, let's acquire more land, let's evict the Native Americans from their land and give land to farmers. A lot of folks are in big cities. They don't want to be farmers, or they're too poor to borrow money to buy land in the first place. So let's protect them. It went against Jackson's beliefs, but he agreed to it. He passed the so-called tariff of abominations through the Congress. And John Calhoun, his vice president, had a huge fit, resigned as vice president, went home to South Carolina and tried to run against him in 1832, lost, and then decided that they just weren't going to pay the taxes there. Calhoun nearly effectively runs a revolt from the state of South Carolina, saying this new tariff is so awful, our state will pass an ordinance saying we refuse to allow the federal government to collect it. So we will send our police in Charleston to go arrest federal tax collectors. I mean, this is insanity. I mean, imagine tomorrow if Biden said, hey, I'm going to shut down, or I guess it would be the state official, right? It would be Governor Newsom saying we're going to shut down all the military bases in California, send the police out to close them all down and arrest every postal employee. And it'd be insane to do that kind of stuff. This is what Calhoun did. And again, looking down the barrel of Civil War, Henry Clay comes out of the woodwork to save the day because Jackson was not bowing down from this fight. He passes an act through Congress called the Force Bill, which allowed him to raise an army and use it to march into South Carolina to collect this tariff. Henry Clay saw that neither one of these macho guys was going to back down. Their egos would get the U.S. involved in a huge civil war. So finally, South Carolina negotiated. They got some concessions, a reduction in the tariff. Clay agreed that the tariff was unbelievably high. It was 50% of the value of these imported goods, so that it would be reduced down to 25%. 5 years. We'll just kind of, no one will even know. We'll just kind of gradually reduce the tariff year after year until it's down to 25% in 5 years. And then we'll just back away from this. So South Carolina learns it pays to threaten civil war. If you threaten to leave the Union, you get all these concessions. And so they would continuously do this. And then it becomes like the boy who cried wolf, where nobody believes South Carolina when they say they'll secede. So to me, that's Jackson's finest moment. He gives a wonderful speech in 1833, calling on the people of South Carolina not to follow their leaders and telling them, don't be fooled, disunion by armed force is treason. That if you break up the Union by a threat of armed force, you're not heroes, you're not revolutionaries, you are rebels, you're criminals, so don't do it. Great moment to Jackson. To me, it's about his only good moment. But this is what he achieved. This is what he did. Probably the lowest moment would be the so-called Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson had been in multiple conflicts with Native Americans and did not see them as equals or even human beings. Very racist attitudes towards Native Americans. And remember, there's this big political conflict over the Cherokee in Georgia. The Cherokee were quite prosperous, in fact. They had quite a bit of land in northwestern Georgia. They had their own cotton plantations, believe it or not. Some of the Cherokees owned African slaves. They produced cotton. They had homes. They all spoke English. They were all Protestant. They had their own newspaper, the Cherokee Nation, published in English. They did everything under the treaty that they were ordered to do from the 1700s, but it wasn't good enough. The state of Georgia decided that they were going to seize that land, move the Cherokee off of it, and auction it off to poor white people who were landless. And so the Cherokee sue. They go to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall says, we agree, this is illegal. You cannot move the Cherokee off of their land. So they win their case, they did everything right, and Andrew Jackson still says, well, I'm going to go to Congress and get the Indian Removal Act passed, and it'll authorize the U.S. Army to go out and move the Cherokee against the Supreme Court's wishes, which is highly illegal and unconstitutional, but this was done. This is the so-called Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of Native Americans, both not just the Cherokee, but the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, are all removed from the Southeast and marched some 2,000 miles to Oklahoma upon a journey which something like a quarter of them perished from freezing to death and starvation, everything else. So that's Andrew Jackson's legacy as well. What else can we say about his presidency? Well, probably the biggest conflict. It wasn't actually this issue over Native Americans that stimulated the Whig Party to reemerge. It was the bank war. Amazingly, people got more mad about that, white people did, than how the Native Americans were treated. The Second National Bank is chartered in 1816. It had a 20-year charter. It was set to expire in 1836, and that was an election year, and Jackson just couldn't wait. He decided he was going to put it out of its misery. Effectively, it was going to die anyway. He got reelected in 32. Clay's whole plan was to pass a rechartering of it, which Jackson vetoed, and then that would allow Clay to win the election. Well, Clay lost the election anyway, despite that. And then Jackson decided to liquidate the bank. 2 years before it was set to expire, he ordered that the funds be removed, which is illegal. You're not allowed to do that. Only the Secretary of the Treasury, and only under an act of Congress, can do that, but he did it because he had this big problem with the bank. He didn't trust banks. He thought paper money was just the worst thing. We needed to have, gold and silver be the currency of the US. And he just felt that using the vast resources of the US government through taxation, if you gave that money to banks through because the National Bank would then put it into other banks, and then other banks would say, goody, thank you for giving this to me. I'll loan it out and I'll make money off of other people's money. Well, that's how banking works. It's making money off of other people's money, but there is value and skill and effort involved in it. But a lot of people don't see that. They just see bankers as parasites. Farmers and planters actually produce things that get wealth. Bankers are parasites that just leech off the economy and destroy it, which that's not a true configuration of what banking is, but people imagine it to be. Jackson also felt that the British controlled too much of an interest in the National Bank, which they controlled a lot of it, but it wasn't like they controlled our government or our economy. And so Jackson liquidated the bank. He was censured for this, which is kind of just a step under impeachment when most of the Senate decides they want to give you a slap on the wrist and they adopt a resolution that say, naughty president, you shouldn't have done this. But nothing else really happens to Jackson, even though he effectively broke the law here and destroyed the economy. After he liquidates the bank, he issues his specie circular that says that all payments to the U.S. government and paying the tax, that's the tariff or the excise tax, or land sales to buy land has to be done in gold and silver. You can't buy it in paper money. This caused a panic because when the government says this, then everybody starts to say, well, what's wrong with my paper money, right? It's a weird psychological thing. Like, you guys all know that you can take your US dollars, and even if they're ripped in half, you just put Scotch tape around it. If the serial numbers match, it's fine, because the federal government still takes it. Businesses take it because they know their bank will take it. Banks will take it because they know the Federal Reserve will take it. But once the Federal Reserve says we're not taking torn bills, then everybody freaks out. This is the way it is in Nicaragua. It's very odd. You can use US dollars in Nicaragua, but if there's any slight tear in it, no one will take it, because Nicaraguan taxi cab drivers can't put it in banks. Banks won't accept it because their central bank won't accept it. It's just a weird psychological phenomenon. And so people started panicking. What's wrong with our paper money? Why won't the government take the paper money anymore? People started hoarding currency and trying to use their paper currency. No one wanted to accept it. All the gold and silver was sucked out of the US economy and hoarded, and it effectively collapsed the economy. This is even worse than the Panic of 1819, far worse, because more of America had become industrialized, and it was a much deeper recession. It ruined Martin Van Buren's presidency. He follows Andrew Jackson. He's elected in 1836. And there's a 5-year recession. His entire presidency is this recession, and everybody refers to him as Martin Van Ruin because there was some 25% unemployment in his home city of New York City. So what else to say about this era? We get our new opposition party, the Whigs, because it was felt Andrew Jackson was a tyrant by liquidating the bank. We start to get American writers that are pretty darn good. For a long time, all through the colonial period and for several decades afterwards, America didn't really produce artists or authors of any merit, shall we say. Americans, because we could speak and read English, we read literature from the mother country, which was far superior. And then in the 1820s, you start to get pretty good authors like James Fenimore Cooper. He's going to write the book, The Last of the Mohicans. And then Washington Irving, who wrote a bunch of different stuff, but probably the most famous is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He also wrote the tales of Rip Van Winkle, the old man who falls asleep, right, for 20 years or whatever the heck it was. And these books are pretty darn good. And then there's a whole school of art that starts to come out, the Hudson River School. The school opens at this time, and artists are churned out that are actually pretty good and can compete with European artists at the same time. So America's coming into its own as kind of a respected global player. At the same time, there was the Industrial Revolution comes to print. Steam power was running factories and building all kinds of stuff, tables, chairs, teapots, all of this stuff was being made in factories with steam power, along with textiles, and also newspapers. And this vastly increased newspaper output. The price of newspapers collapsed, a penny or half a penny in a lot of situations to buy a newspaper. We were a very literate society, and before there were professional sports and TV and all these other distractions, this was what Americans did for fun. We were sort of a cafe society where people would go out, at least men would, and sit down and have a beer with their friends, and they'd get the newspaper out and talk about political issues, which is kind of extraordinary. This is how it is in Israel or in Europe. A lot of people on Fridays, they don't do what Americans do. Come on over to the ball game. I'll get the chicken wings, right? Most Europeans go out to a cafe. They'll sip their espresso for a couple hours, and they'll, get their copy of Le Monde out, and they'll, read about global affairs and debate about it and stuff. I'm sure a lot of French people are also watching, soccer and stuff like that, but it's much more, that's kind of their, that's what they like to do on a Friday night. So, that's Andrew Jackson. Let's move to the market revolution. Okay, we got about an hour left. I need to pick up the pace here so we can get through some of these chapters. So this is going to be the beginnings of industrialization during this particular time period. So number of things come together in the early 19th century that bring about early industrialization. The first would be the steamship, which is invented by an American inventing team, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston. They attach a steam engine to a paddle wheel, and they're able to now move against the current of a river and ship goods back and forth. Because the US has just, God bless this land, and gave us the best navigable river system on earth, it was very easy. Almost everyone in America at the time lived on a river. The West Coast doesn't, because we're developed much later when you don't need to be on a river. Things are moved by truck now. But 200 years ago, everybody lived by rivers. Everybody lived either on the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Hudson, the Connecticut, the Rappahannock, the Tappahannock, all these various tributaries east of the Appalachians. And this was wonderful. People could now reach markets. You could now take your goods that you produced on your farm and ship them long and far to people that you never met before. And this was great for the economy. It facilitated trade and everything else. At the same time, the Lowell Mills will open in 1840. So now with steam power, we're manufacturing textiles. That would only explode. And then further and further, we're going to have steam power manufacture, like I said, teapots and tables and chairs and furniture and all the rest of it. So production will vastly increase, which brings prices down. Shipping costs drastically come down. And then there's a canal digging boom. Anybody who doesn't live on a river or who lives, west of the Appalachians, and there's no rivers that run east and west through the Appalachians, we're going to dig a canal. We're going to blow these mountains apart, dig this canal 364 miles long, and we're going to connect Ohio with New York City so that goods don't have to be hauled overland here. They can go either up the Mississippi or through New York, up the Hudson and down the Erie Canal. So this facilitated trade and communication. Americans were more tied together through these sort of trade networks, and the price of everything came down. More and more people are starting to buy pre-made, like ready-made things. Used to be you went to a tailor and they'd measure you and they'd make you your own individual suit, and you might have one suit your whole life and it was super expensive. And now people started to buy things mass-produced, ready to wear that were much cheaper. That's how we buy things nowadays. We go to Target or Walmart and just buy something off the rack that magically fits us, right? Or maybe it doesn't, but that's how we do it because it's way too expensive to go and get something tailor-made. In the 1840s, the telegraph comes out, which was amazing. This was a quantum leap in telecommunications. This is the first time ever where the physical message was separated from communication, meaning you didn't have to carry a note anymore, via a horseman. You could send a message via electrical pulses through insulated wires. Now, it was very primitive. You couldn't talk over it. That's not until 1876 with the telephone. You would just send pulses and you just make a code out of it. You train people to read and send the code. And now you have the ability to communicate, which is extraordinary. It was unbelievable what this did to unleash, human energies. The Second National Bank is chartered, and now we had a paper currency working. The Second National Bank would die in 1836, but it almost didn't matter because the gold rush would come in a decade later in California that would stabilize the currency. And then for decades afterwards, no one really complained about the banking system because it was stable via the gold rush. You started to get new millionaires like John Jacob Astor, who didn't own any factories and also didn't own any plantations. He just bought land and flipped it. That's all he did. He just bought up a whole lot of Manhattan as Manhattan was being paved over from south to north, and he just would buy it and then sell it to business interests that wanted it and made a fortune off of flipping land. He bought a lot of the land in Louisiana. He bought a lot of land in Oregon and sold it to people. Bought it for $1 and sold it for $2, basically. And he became one of the first millionaire investors in American history. Agriculture becomes more commercialized now. People are now using more and more machinery to mass produce things, less and less relying on human labor, more and more on machine output, and then shipping these things long distances on steamships to commercial markets. Along with this will come urbanization. Necessarily always does, because you have to build industrial production means that you have a factory where hundreds, if not thousands of people all have to live around that factory and commute into work every day. So cities will explode in the 19th century, New York City being the prototype. It goes from about 200,000 people in 1820 to about 1 million in 1860. It multiplies fivefold in 40 years. And it just continuously blows up until 1898. There's 5 million people in New York. And by the 1920s, there's 8 million people in New York. And then the population stabilizes. It can't really get any bigger or denser than it is now. But it's not just New York. It's every major city, every major economic center where there's a factory. It just blows up at this particular time period. Along with this in America, you need immigration because we have this constant problem of a labor shortage. Because of the size of the country, because of the amount of land, most people born in America, because of Jeffersonian, ideas about the virtuous citizen being a yeoman farmer, didn't want to move into a factory, thought it was beneath them. So they moved west and bought land and became independent farmers. It was immigrants, the Irish and the Germans who poured in at this time, who worked in factories, dug canals, became the miners and stuff. And so immigration will flourish at this time period. The Irish had it much harder. They were fleeing the potato famine, and they came here with nothing or almost nothing, and they stayed in East Coast enclaves like New York City, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia. The Germans would mostly move to the West. They came with a bit of money after the aborted 1848 revolution. They were intellectuals. Most of them spoke English already. Half of them were Protestant. And so they'll go to places like Ohio, Illinois, Nebraska, the Dakotas, that area. And they become largely corn and grain farmers, rye and barley farmers. And they brew beer, they have their own newspapers, and they do rather well. The Irish are going to come in much smaller numbers. They're going to be confined to East Coast cities. They'll be industrial laborers, and they suffer much more discrimination than the Germans. Because of all this immigration, we get quite a bit of nativism in America. You get the American Party, sometimes called the Know Nothing Party, that is a one-issue party. We got to stop immigration because this is destroying our country. There's theories that there's a conspiracy of the Catholic Church to destroy American democracy, flood us with immigrants that take orders from the Pope. These people can't be assimilated, all this kind of stuff. So there's a tremendous amount of discrimination and nativism at this time, yet still the US is allowing millions of people to come into the US at this time. Many of them could vote even though they weren't citizens in the beginning. Quite literally, Irish immigrants are getting off the boat and told, here's your local Catholic church, here's your local tenement house, here's your local saloon, and here's a ballot, and here's election day. Go ahead and vote. You're a white man, and you get to vote in this country. Meanwhile, Black men who lived in New York City, their families did for 200 years, couldn't vote at that time. So let's talk about Eli Whitney. There's an American form of production that is unique to us, and it's still this way. I think I've used this metaphor a lot, but think of any kind of manufactured thing. You could keep it basic, like I usually mention cheese or chocolate, right? Americans, it's all about quantity, right? We eat cheese sprayed out from a can, or spreadable from a jar, or this bright orange colored rubber stuff, the individual sliced craft singles. And they're cheap, right? We want to get 180 slices from Costco, right? Value, quantity. Whereas Europeans are much more about quality. They want it to taste really good. They want it to be, high quality. And so this permeates everything in America. Look at our cars. They're nice, but Europeans have much more pride in it. Europeans had these guilds from the medieval age. They protected their industries. America didn't have this. And the American attitude is, read it in a book, look it up on YouTube, learn how to do it yourself. It ain't that hard, and you could change jobs back and forth. The average American in the 1830s changed jobs 3 or 4 times. They were always farmers, but almost everybody had a trade as well in the off season, right? You would live in Ohio, you'd be a grain farmer for 6 months a year, but in, November to April, there's not much to do on a grain farm. And so you get out the silver work and you make teapots, or you become a tanner and you learn how to make leather, or a cooper, you learn how to make barrels, and you would just get a book and teach yourself how to do it and then take up that trade. That's the American system. Notice that we don't really do vocational education in America. It's not like you go to school and they teach you to become a plumber or a mechanic or an electrician. America has this kind of liberal arts education where we teach you a little bit of everything and we turn you loose and say, figure it out, go get your further education. And that goes to our mode of production too. Eli Whitney basically said, it's so inefficient, these rifles, the trigger breaks and you got to buy a new rifle, or make a whole new one over again. Why don't we make each part identical to each other, so you just replace that part? And that's the way we do it, right? Car breaks down, you can just take it to a dealership and they got the part there. Now, notice it's, if you go to a place where you have a car that's a mass-produced one, a Honda, a Toyota, a Ford, a Chevy, whatever, they just punch it up in the computer. Oh, you need this particular, piece for it. Try that with a German-made car, right? Or a Swedish-made one. You take a Saab or a Volvo or an Audi to a dealership, they'll say, this is metric, we don't know what's going on with it, and these parts are handcrafted, we can't do anything with it, which is, sort of the curse of the European car owner. But it goes to those two different attitudes towards production. Eli Whitney said, let's just mass produce things. We'll take the skill out of it because we're going to have an uneducated workforce from Europe and they just want to pull handles over and over again, do repetition. So we quote, de-skill our labor in factories. That's what we do. Europeans always ridicule this, but it's made America, very prosperous, is that the quality is a bit lower. It's not terrible, but the quantity just drowns out all the competitors. It's the way we won World War II, right? Things start to happen because of industrialization to family size. Protestant women in big cities start to have fewer kids, intentionally so, because they have to go buy food. They can't just produce more. and they have to provide for the education of children. So middle-class Protestant women start to utilize birth control. They have, 2 to 3 kids instead of 7. And so the birth rate starts to drop during this time period. Still, most Americans were rural, so, families were much bigger by today's standards, but within cities, you start to see this. So women start to have sort of second careers almost, where they're mother from, 20 to 40, and then they become reformers from their 40s onward. Women in the 1830s and 40s will join abolitionist movements. They'll join other reform movements, Sabbatarian movements to keep the Sabbath holy, close things down on Sundays. They join the suffrage movement, the feminist movement. And women were the temperance movement, abolishing alcohol. Women became intensely involved in these things in the Second Great Awakening. Religion starts to spread and dominate. Those 3 old world churches basically collapse in the 1830s. So the Congregationalist Church of Massachusetts, the old Puritan church, everybody basically leaves it. The Anglican Church had already imploded, and the Scottish Presbyterian Church effectively just renames itself. And so you get 3 major denominations, what are called mainline Protestants, and that's the Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist churches. And they are brand new in the 1820s. They spread like wildfire. Churches are built all over America, and people who hadn't really been to church that much in the early 19th century are now flocking in because they addressed all these issues of temperance and abolitionism and all the rest of it. Along with this, there's this ideological trend of transcendentalism. It's basically a literary movement. I talked a moment ago about Fenimore Cooper, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the other one. It was Washington Irving. But really, that was just 2 authors, and they weren't terribly well respected outside of the US, but Americans read them. There's an explosion of writers in the 1850s that are rather good. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, probably the greatest of them. He wrote Moby Dick. And the ethos, the spirit of this is sort of the Romantic era, right? That the Enlightenment goes from 1688, the Glorious Revolution, to about 1815, the end of the French Revolution, where the warnings are, geez, human beings can't just plan out society. It leads to disaster. And so a lot of the themes of transcendentalism are that we should preserve nature, remember we're spiritual beings, the parks movement, right? As we pave over our cities, let's preserve part of it so people can breathe fresh air. Let's go camping, hiking, ice skating, during the summer and winter months so people can breathe fresh air, get outside. Baseball is developed as a sport in the 1840s, a pastoral sport where you get outside to grass and open field and breathe fresh air every day of the summer. So these are all movements within the Romantic or Transcendentalist movement, right? The point of Frankenstein, the book, don't play God, right? If you resurrect the dead, bad things will happen. So scientists don't just rely on logic and scientific discovery. We need to have morality and spirituality too. Okay, moving right along. Social revolution. So this is again about industrialization in big cities, so I can just touch on some of this kind of stuff. There were indeed riots and problems with immigration. The Irish were indeed a bit unruly. Now, a lot of that was because of discrimination, but a lot of it was just silly stuff, like the Astor Palace riot. This was a riot, funnily enough, about who played Macbeth better on Broadway. There were 2 theaters across the street from each other. The waspy American upper middle class people would go and watch the British actor do it. The Irish immigrants, who hated the British, of course, for a very good reason, this is the potato famine after all, they went and watched the American actor. So the Irish are almost, more American than the Americans. And then when these 2 shows let out, they came out into the street and were arguing over who was better and got into huge fist fights, right? It's kind of like, Yankee and Red Sox fans almost. It was a huge riot for multiple days over this silly little issue. And so because of this, there was, and there's not just one riot, there were dozens of these types of disturbances all during this period. It's a big backlash against immigration, a lot of anti-Catholic, anti-Irish feeling in big cities. Irish got into Tammany Hall, these political machines. You would go to your saloon keeper was usually an alderman or a city council member, some corrupt political officer. They ran the bar, they served you beers, you could eat a free lunch there, you got job listings there because it was the alderman, they had hiring rights for certain city projects. You could put your earnings in the bank there. They had a safe on site because you couldn't get a bank account at a regular, bank. And so this plugged them in the political system. Now there was a tremendous amount of corruption in Tammany Hall, but the Irish needed to vote, move up in the system, and that's how they do. This is how the Irish become the police force. By about the 1880s, every East Coast city has an Irish police chief, and mostly an Irish police staff. I mean, this is a stereotype in most cop dramas that you watch. Chief Kelly is chief of police in New York, right? Always some Irish. Chief O'Hallahan, right? They always seem to be like that. And it's still largely like that in most American cities. In the East Coast, we don't have a big Irish population in Los Angeles or Long Beach. So we covered most of this stuff already. We did the Second Great Awakening. So we could talk a little bit about the spirituality of it. There were a lot of reform movements that spurred on the Second Great Awakening. So abolitionism, temperate, the alcohol consumption rate was off the charts. And so Americans were drinking about 7 gallons of alcohol per year, which 88 bottles of whiskey. That was drastically reduced down to 2 by the early 1850s because so many churches opened up. Almost every community had a church and almost everybody was a member. Throughout history and throughout time and throughout place, I don't know why this is, but it's true. Women tend to be more religious than men. They tend to take care of, the spirituality of the family. It's sort of how women, before feminism got plugged into social networks and stuff. You didn't have the office, but you could go to church and talk to people in community and learn and disseminate information as well. And so women join these churches, bring the husband and children along, and then the preacher says, hey, husbands, get up here. You're going to take a pledge not to drink as much as you used to, or take a tea for total pledge. These people were called teetotalers. And so alcohol consumption drastically reduced at this period, which was a very good thing because it was catastrophically high. It's amazing anybody could do anything having, 7 drinks a day, but they did. And this drastically reduced it. Productivity increased, health increased, life expectancy increased. It was a great thing. Abolitionism will flourish during this time. You get wonderful white abolitionists, black abolitionists, ones of different stripes. You get people like Lloyd Garrison, you get people like Elijah Lovejoy, you get others, most of them are Unitarian or Episcopalian ministers. But then you get former slaves like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, who then dedicate their lives to liberating slaves. And they will say, you don't need the New Testament to tell you slavery's awful. I lived it and I will tell you about it. Each year, abolitionism grows and grows and grows. In 1831, it was a lunatic fringe movement. Most people didn't take it serious at all. They just sort of rolled their eyes, just said, oh, these people need to get lives. But by 1840, they have a presidential candidate, James Birney of Alabama. He was a former slave owner who freed his slaves and ran for president. He doesn't win, he doesn't come close, but he gets like 2 or 3% of the vote. By 1848, Martin Van Buren forms the Free Soil Party, not a hardcore abolitionist party to abolish slavery in states where it existed, but keeping the territories free, an anti-slavery party. He wins something like 10 or 15% of the vote that year. And by 1860, Abraham Lincoln's the president, and he wins. So this is a movement that grew and grew and grew and grew. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin come out. Other books, Slavery Itself by Theodore Weld. It was just a compilation of stories that slaves told with pictures. The photograph was something that was really fueling this. Photography comes out in the 1830s. The French invent the daguerreotype, and then it's kind of improved and perfected. So now you couldn't hide it anymore, right? In the 1700s, you could say, I know slavery exists, but it's an abstraction. I live in Massachusetts, I don't see it. But in the 1840s, there were picture books where you could see it, and it was haunting, it was chilling, and Northerners couldn't pretend it didn't exist anymore. So abolitionism would grow, it would become bigger and bigger. Really, the heart of the Second Great Awakening is this phenomenon called perfectionism. It's a much more positive theology than the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening said, we've gotten too soft in our religion. We need to get more conservative. God doesn't love most of us. He's not going to choose us. He's not going to elect us. Predestination is our theory. 100 years later in the 1830s, it was a much kinder, gentler attitude. A lot of this was, let's help people. Let's help prostitutes, drug addicts, alcoholics, just people that have been discarded by society. We love you, brother. We love you, sister. Come to our church. And the Bible was seen not just as redemption for the afterlife, but a blueprint for this life and how to get off drugs, to keep a family together. It was a blueprint for how to build a proper home, family, and society. And so churches flourished. There was a lot of building of new churches, and Charles Finney and Lyman Beecher are the two major preachers that kind of give the underpinning of ideology to this movement about what the movement was all about. And it's a very positive, wonderful movement. I think it's very elegant and beautiful because it wasn't the government that was doing this, promoting and converting people. It was just grassroots people that were using communities and churches to solve actual problems in society. Now, they were a bit myopic in this. What that means is sort of short-sighted. It's when your view is so wide that you can't see very deep. And what that means is they saw the Bible as the solution to every problem, right? This is how you solve prostitution and alcoholism and everything. And science tells us now, and economics tells us now, that that doesn't always work. It can work sometimes. Aliana's asking about bootleggers and such. Not quite yet, because this is not really the government banning alcohol. Some counties did, no states did at this particular time. Most temperance people, most women, were not calling for the abolition of alcohol entirely. They were calling for temperance, which means the individual, right? This is a very conservative ideology, which is, liberals tend to say government needs to take control and ban stuff. Conservatives say, well, churches, individuals, like local communities need to set those standards, right? If you don't like a particular television show or book or movie, you don't get the government to ban it. You get churches together to say, we won't watch it or support it. And that might be more effective because it's, tapping into better instincts than government banning it. Governments weren't banning liquor at this time. They just used guilt and shame. It's a great mechanism, right? It's how you you get men to take an oath before God in the congregation, and they took that seriously, and they kind of quit drinking on their own. The bootlegging will come later in the 20s when the government does ban alcohol entirely. And we see that that doesn't work. It's not as effective, which is interesting for the illegal drug trade. What's more effective, right? Some countries like Portugal have effectively legalized drugs, and they haven't really seen an increase in it. And in fact, it's solved the problem in a lot of ways. Whereas in America, it's the attitude is, well, if we legalize it, then use will increase. It sends a bad message to kids about addiction, etc. Sometimes banning things isn't the most effective way to get rid of it. Sometimes society and using social mechanisms is. Okay. Then we have utopianism. The mainstream churches were pretty mellow and mild and actually rather progressive at this time, the Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist churches. But there were some that were pretty radical in every sense. And so these developed in what's called the burned over district in upstate New York. So burned over because it would be like a new fad, like a new church would develop. It's kind of like 10 years ago, I had never heard of kombucha. I had never seen yoga pants 15 years ago. And now like it's everywhere, right? And it's a fad, and it'll probably go away soon. I see everybody's wearing high-waisted jeans now. I think that took over during the pandemic. 15 years ago, it was all like, low-rise jeans were all the rage. These are fads that kind of come in and out of existence. And that's what they meant by the burned over district. For like 5 years, it was like a string of Millerite churches, like 15, 20 of them would come about, and then they would just fizzle out and disappear, and a new one would emerge in its place. That's why they called it the burned over district. So you had the Millerites, right? This was the guy who said the world would end on October 22nd, 1843, and it didn't. So they were apocalyptic. They said, like the hippies of the 60s, let's live communally. The idea was that capitalism was corrupt. It was anti-Christian. We had to give up our possessions and live together in harmony. And some of them were good-natured people. They thought society was wicked because we endorsed slavery under our Constitution, and people were sort of retreating from sinful society. And they weren't entirely wrong about all of it. They were a little kooky about some of it, though. The Oneidas experienced, plural, not even marriage, we would say, but, pluralistic monogamy. Basically, have relationships with whoever you want to have it with. No one will be monogamously married to anyone, and no one will know whose children are whose children. Kind of a weird society that collapsed and fell apart because it went against human nature. Others, like the Shakers, were the opposite. They believed in 100% abstinence, even between married couples. Like even married couples shouldn't have sex, which, you might ask, well, how on earth are we going to procreate as a species? But their church grew nonetheless because they converted more and more people. They adopted a lot of babies nobody else wanted, but the movement died out. There was a lot of experimentation with how society should look, and people said, we don't like this whole capitalism thing. Change freaks people out. Look what's going on now. There's been a lot of change in the last 20 years, social change, attitudes towards all kinds of stuff, and it's freaking some people out. And so some people react in very illogical ways, and the 1840s was no exception to that. Seneca Falls, the women's rights movement, first wave feminism really kicks off, and it's fascinating. It's the summer of revolutions. France has a revolution in Paris in 1848. So does Berlin, so does Austria, so does Rome. Every major European capital had a revolution in 1848. And in America, we kind of have two. Rhode Island had sort of an attempted revolution. It's not talked about much, and it's really not that important. But the same ideas that were going around in Europe were going around Rhode Island and then upstate New York. Women's rights groups said, we deserve to have an equal say as well. The men of America became free in 1776. We need our own liberation now. And they got a taste of that political culture in the abolitionist and temperance movement. And so they held this conference to say women deserve the right to vote. It takes some time, but they would gain that by 1920. Okay, going to chapter 14. We got about a half an hour left. So the antebellum West. So the West before the Civil War was way out on the frontier. Notice that a lot of this areas are still territories, right? This is a map. I'll go down a couple of slides of America in 1861, just right at the Civil War. But you see huge swaths of America still territories, largely inhabited by Native Americans, not very many white settlers in these particular areas, but it was very rugged and rural at this particular time. So we can skip Lewis and Clark. We talked about it before. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, these both lead back to St. Louis. One of them goes northward towards the Pacific coast. The other one goes southward. Not much to say about that particular thing. Manifest destiny is a huge concept that you absolutely have to know for US history. It's very much akin to the white man's burden that came out of Great Britain, sort of an imperialist attitude that the United States is the sort of God's chosen nation because we are a free republic on the one hand, but also a lot of racism is imbued into this, is that we are a white nation, or a nation dominated by whites over non-whites. And so we need to, quote, civilize this area because it's just being left to, wilderness by Native Americans in the West. So we need to take it over because we're going to bring telegraph lines and electricity and all the rest of it. So this attitude very much alive, even I would say, and during the colonial period. Part of the revolution was about this, going west and violating the Proclamation of 1763. The Louisiana Purchase, Republican agrarianism. This attitude had different names, but it finally is coined in 1844 by John O'Sullivan, a newspaper writer, who said, it's America's manifest destiny, our obvious fate, to spread from sea to shining sea, right? Is that these other people that are there, we're just going to brush them aside and we're going to take it all. It's going to fall into our lap, quite frankly. But it's sort of an attitude that justifies imperialism. And so this comes into play over Texas. Texas was part of Mexico, lots of white migration there to defend against the Comanche, who were threatening the Mexican government there. And after 10 years of immigration, whites are the majority. There's a lot of tension between Texans and Tejanos there. And eventually there would be a revolt. It wasn't just Texas, but multiple Mexican states rose up against the tyranny of Santa Anna, the president there. And Texas wins this revolt when every other Mexican state loses. And Texas has this sort of second revolt. If you ever wonder why Texans seem to be very arrogant about their state and very, proud of where they're from, overly proud, I would say, it's the Texas revolt. They sort of feel like they're refried Americans. They're Americans twice over. We celebrate 1776 with y'all, but we have our own revolution that's separate and distinct and just as glorious, right? Instead of George III, we got Antonio Lopez Santa Anna. Instead of Lexington and Concord, we have the Alamo, and so they win. independence, and they became their own republic for 10 years, from 1836 to 1845. It was the Lone Star Republic, the Republic of Texas. Eventually, we would annex Texas. It would add a new slave state. It creates a lot of problems, and it basically leads to a war with Mexico. The US would win the war, and along with Texas, we would be able to annex all of New Mexico and California. And understand that New Mexico and California doesn't mean just the states that we call that. It's basically in the entire Southwest. Through the Mexican War, the US was able to acquire Texas, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Wyoming, and California. Huge amount of territory. At the same time, Polk negotiated this agreement, kind of updating the one that John Quincy Adams did that I told you about an hour ago, where we had a condominium, a joint occupation of Oregon. We now would bisect that, just cut it in half at 49 degrees latitude. Polk for a while was saying 54-40 or fight. We want it all, but he negotiated with the British. So under Polk's presidency, all those states I just mentioned, we also get Oregon, Washington, and Idaho at the same time. He actually presides in 4 years over the acquisition of more land than any other president in our history. I mean, it's not even close. Even Alaska doesn't compare with how big, this particular land acquisition was. And I, got to say that we all benefited from this because we're all sitting right now on land that was acquired in this. And California is pretty awesome, I got to say. After the war, we get the gold rush, right? You got to feel bad for the Spanish and the Mexican government. They had been in control of California for some 300 years, dug up the whole area, couldn't find gold. It's ours for only about 6 months. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is February of 1848. 6 months later, the U.S. At Sutter's Mill discovers gold. They tell everybody, keep it quiet, but word leaks and everyone comes out of the woodwork, descends on California. The population surges and we can become a state. Wonderful. This almost broke up the Union. There had already been trouble in 1820 over new states or new territories becoming states. Would it be slave or free? We'd finally settled all that in 1820. So we thought there were no disagreements because 3630 slavery was banned. There was no surprises and everybody knew those areas would come in as free except for Oklahoma. And then when we declared war on Mexico, David Wilmot suggested the Wilmot Proviso, kind of like the Talmadge Amendment, right? Any new territory that we get from this war with Mexico should be free. We should abolish slavery there. It passed the House. It does not pass the Senate. It never technically passes, but it's known for breaking down our party system, basically, because every Northern Whig voted for it, along with every Northern Democrat, and every Southern Whig and Southern Democrat voted against it, which was a warning sign. If you have sectional parties, North versus South, people sort of say, well, why are we even in the Union together? It's kind of like what's going on in Britain now. Britain is very regionalized. They don't have states, they have kingdoms from the ancient world. And so Scotland is very liberal. They want to be in the European Union. They don't want American nuclear bases on their land. Very progressive. And they vote very differently than England does. And they sort of feel like, why are we even in the United Kingdom anymore? And they more and more and more are talking about secession and becoming their own country. And hopefully that stays peaceful over there. But that's, politically speaking, a very, very dangerous thing, having parties that are identified by section. Like us in this state, we're going to be a separate party with different interests than the rest of the country. You want parties to be intermixed across state lines so that civil wars are impossible, you hope. So the Wilmot Proviso was a big warning sign to everybody, and this would lead to the Compromise of 1850. We, pretty much had to do it. California becomes, or wants to become a state. It has the population to become a state, but it's a free state or free territory. It was the reverse of the Missouri situation. Because Mexico had California prior to our acquisition of it, they had abolished slavery there. Slavery did not exist. And so if we were going to come in just a year or two after territorial, status, it was going to be free, clearly. And Southerners felt, in this instance, the way Northerners felt in 1820, we didn't get a say in this. Mexico had abolished slavery. It was done before we got it. Northerners said, well, that was the same thing with Missouri. The French had decided the issue long before us. We didn't get a say in it. We want to be able to vote on it now. Californians were determined to keep California free. And so this created a huge crisis. We could not get past it because, again, the Senate was deadlocked. There was, no way. In fact, with the acquisition of Texas, they had a two-state or a two-vote margin for the South. They were not going to allow any law to pass that would make California free without any kind of other concession. And so it looked rather difficult at this period. Weirdly enough, our president, Zachary Taylor, was a slave owner. He owned plantations in Louisiana. He grew both sugar and cotton. But because he spent his life in the Army and lived most of his life outside of the South, he had kind of a Northern perspective on things. He thought Southerners were the problem in this. He thought the way of the future was Yankee capitalism. He thought slavery was divisive, and therefore he did not want it to spread into the West. And so he advocated the Wilmot Proviso, ban slavery in all of the Mexican territories, allow New Mexico and California to come in as free states. And that just was not going to happen, but that was his goal. He's going to die of gastroenteritis in the summer of 1850, which allows his vice president, Millard Fillmore, to cut a deal. In the Senate, Stephen Douglas and Henry Clay are going to work very hard to hammer out this compromise. So here's all the parts of the compromise of 1850. One, California would indeed enter the Union as a free state. There was no getting around that. It would be a huge effort to try to change that, cut California in 2 or 3 or 4 parts and allow some of it to be slave or dominate, make us into a slave state. That wasn't going to happen. So we come in as a free state. There will be no slave state to balance it out because there was no, other slave state to balance it out. In fact, Texas would be the last slave state. On the eve of the Civil War, it seemed like the South was winning a lot of these arguments and debates, like politically on the ground. They seemed to be getting their way, with one exception, and that was the state race. Because after Texas, California enters as a free state, Oregon does, Iowa does, Minnesota does, and Southerners just felt we're behind and we'll never catch up. So that's California. Then you get the Fugitive Slave Act, a much stronger, harsher one, which was a huge concession to the South. Effectively, by 1850, you don't have a Fugitive Slave Act anymore. You had one in 1793, but it was quite weak. Slave owners could not even really regain slaves who escaped, certainly not to Massachusetts. These personal liberty laws that have been passed there were so strong, it was effectively a separate country in those northern states. And so Southerners got upset that Yankees were violating the law. And so a much stronger, vigorous Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which turned the tables. Posters went up all over the North warning free blacks, slave catchers are everywhere, travel in packs, make sure that you're never alone, make sure that you always have witnesses and papers on you. There are thousands of African Americans that flee to Canada after this because it's not just runaway slaves that have to fear. Even free blacks feared this because there were cases, like if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, true story, Solomon Northrop, a free man from Saratoga Springs, was tricked into a job. He was a violin player. He was tricked to come down to Washington, D.C., audition for a part where he was drugged and then sold into slavery. And he could not prove in court that he was free because he couldn't testify because he was black. And federal court, you couldn't do that. And so this was a terrible law that Southerners demanded and Northerners hated. And really, it probably backfired on them. Yeah, they gained a couple of hundred slaves that escaped in the 1850s, but this turned more Northerners to abolitionism than ever before. Northerners might not have been too sympathetic towards slaves, but what they hated to see was federal agents invade their city, kidnap people, and take them away. They did not like that at all. There's several incidents in Boston where, very publicly the army is marching runaways to the port and people are screaming at the soldiers and throwing rotten food at them and stuff. And then you have the DC trade ban. DC federal territory, the only area where the federal government can really govern other than the territories out west. Slavery was allowed, and then slave auctions were allowed, and the slave auctions finally ended. Northerners got so tired of this, they said, well, we can't get rid of slavery itself because Washington, D.C. is in the South with plantations, but we can get rid of the slave auctions, which are awful, disgusting, things, and it needs to disappear in our nation's capital. Finally, the most important part of the Compromise of 1850 was the popular sovereignty doctrine. What do we do with the territories? And this was very telling, because 30 years prior in 1820, we could actually come to an agreement and say 3630, here's the line, and have predictability about territories that became states. By 1850, that was impossible. Northerners wanted it all and Southerners wanted it all. And there was no way to divide. They talked about extending 3630 all the way to California's border. There was talk about, the Wilmot Proviso. None of it was acceptable to, the universal population. Then finally, somebody came up with this idea of popular sovereignty. Let's take it out of the hands of the federal government and give it to the people of that territory. They will decide the issue for themselves. It was a cowardly decision, but it was the only decision that could be made. And this kept the peace. Thankfully enough, it delayed civil war for 10 years so that the Union could industrialize, get stronger, and effectively fight a civil war in the 1860s. Just a few years later, Kansas will erupt. Things were actually, believe it or not, pretty smooth from 1850 to 54, the calm before the storm, sort of like 1770 to 1773 when the British repealed all the taxes, and after the Boston Massacre, things quieted down. Maybe you wouldn't have had a revolution without the Tea Act. Likewise here, you probably don't have a civil war without Kansas, Nebraska. That is sort of 1850 to 54 is the last period of calm. The only outrage going on is the Fugitive Slave Act and the very public enforcement of it, which shocked a lot of people. In 1854, to build a railroad from Chicago to San Francisco, it was decided, since it would go through free territory and that free territory would become free states, Southerners said, we got to overturn this. We will not approve the building of this railroad until we overturn Kansas, Nebraska, and allow popular sovereignty in those territories as well. A betrayal. For 34 years, since 1820, slavery had been totally abolished north of 3630. Let me go to my map. So that's Missouri is here. This is the 3630 line. Everything north of this line in Nebraska and this unorganized territory here would become free. Southerners knew that this railroad would cause this area to populate, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, all of this, Montana, would all become states, and they'd all come in with free state politicians. And so they refused that. They said, let's allow popular sovereignty here. Popular sovereignty worked so well here and kept the peace. Let's change it. Yeah, it worked well here because we were starting from scratch and had no law there. We already have a law here. It's been banned. We already solved that issue. We had an argument that nearly broke us up, and you're going to bring it up again? And they did. And it barely passed. The only reason it really passed was that it wasn't on the ballot in 1852 when that Congress was elected, meaning no one in 1852 who voted thought they were voting for slavery in the territories. That issue had been settled. And so that Congress took up the issue, and enough people just barely, with the help of Southern Whigs, most Democrats voted for it, but without Southern Whigs, it wouldn't have passed. Southern Whigs supported it, and the Whig Party just completely collapsed in the summer of 1854. Northern Whigs split. They refused to negotiate with Southern Whigs, and the party collapsed. And in its place, we get the new Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. It'll mostly be a party of Northern Whigs, that's the nucleus of the party, but they will add a lot of disaffected Northern Democrats who think very differently about the bank and the tariff, but they just feel like, gosh, our party has been taken over by slave owners who really love slavery, and we don't. We don't want slavery to be abolished in the South, but we want the territories to be free. We want at least to be able to talk about it. We want at least a Northern Democrat to get elected. It's like you got to be a slave owner almost to be in the Democratic Party. And so this law, Kansas, Nebraska, enraged the North, broke up one of our political parties, replaced it with one that was much more antagonistic towards slavery. The Whigs basically said, make up your mind. You could be a conscience Whig or a cotton Whig. Republicans said, we are an anti-slavery party. We're not an abolitionist party, although a lot of abolitionists joined it because it was the only viable party against slavery. But the official position was the Wilmot Proviso. All the territories should be free. We're going to overturn the Wilmot Proviso. And now that we opened it up for debate, we're going to overturn popular sovereignty in the Mexican territories as well. This was the moment where the two halves get incredibly antagonistic, and there's no more peace or respite after this. It's just one long march until Civil War. So, we did Kansas, Nebraska, we did nativism and the Know Nothing Party. So then you get Dred Scott, of course, you get this horrible case where Mr. Dred Scott, a Missouri slave, is taken by his owner, Dr. Emerson, to Wisconsin territory where slavery had been abolished under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 under that Articles of Confederation law. And any idiot would know what happens then, right? You take a slave to free territory, they become free. You can't have a slave in free territory, right? It's just, I use this kind of crude analogy, but it would be like if someone took 100 kilos of cocaine on an airplane and like flew it to free territory and said, I get to take this here, right? Or territory where it had been abolished. You don't get to do that. You move to a new territory, you play by those rules. You don't fly to Saudi Arabia and then complain that you aren't free. It's like, well, you decided to come here, you got to play by our rules. And that seemed to be open and shut. All the lower courts said, yeah, dum-dum, don't bring your slave to a free territory. What do you think? You don't complain that they're now free. And so this goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, amazingly, worst decision in its entire history, both morally and legally. It's just legally, it made no sense. 7-2, Roger Brooke Taney, a slave owner himself from Maryland, said that Congress cannot ban slavery in the territories and that blacks, even free blacks, don't have federal rights. You might be a citizen of Vermont as a black person, but you're not a citizen of the United States under federal law. Well, that question was actually an open question. The law didn't say whether they were, and it seemed logical to many people that if you're a free citizen of a northern state, shouldn't you be a free citizen of the republic? But they threw the case out effectively, saying Dred Scott doesn't even have the right to sue, yet we're going to decide the case anyway and decide he's still a slave. This enraged Northerners. A lot of people thought, Northerners are more respectful of the Constitution. Those hotheads in the South are always threatening civil war. Northerners will respect the law and they'll respect the Supreme Court. Well, they didn't rebel violently, but this made them determined that they would win elections, pack the court, and change this decision. So that was Dred Scott. Didn't really solve the issue. Then you get the Lecompton Constitution, right? Kansas was bleeding because of popular sovereignty, because every wacko, every hardcore abolitionist and hardcore anti-abolitionist poured into Kansas and were murdering each other because whoever could populate the region with the most people would be able to decide the slavery question under popular sovereignty. It was just a bloody, god-awful mess. They held a fraudulent election in 1858. It looked on paper like the pro-slavery Constitution would win, but clearly there was fraud. I mean, there was counties where 180% of the population voted for it, and lots of evidence of, quote, border ruffians. This is pro-slavery people from Missouri crossed the border, on election day and then voted illegally in Kansas elections. So we had pretty good records of it. We had to do it again. No. Southerners said Kansas must come in as a slave state. Believe it or not, Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat, blocked it and said, I believe in popular sovereignty, but you got to have a legitimate election. And this ruined Stephen Douglas's career and further divided the Democratic Party. Whigs had imploded, and now going into 1860, the Democratic Party fractured. It wasn't quite fractured yet in 1858, but John Brown's raid would do it. This very violent uprising of a white abolitionist that was trying to free black slaves in Harper's Ferry, arm them, and then have this big snowball revolution was foiled, but it drove fear into the heart of every Southerner. Every Southerner now suspects every Yankee of plotting, even though John Brown was a fringe kind of lunatic person. It was not a very well planned or staged revolt. Shouldn't have been fearful to anyone, but everyone was now terrified. Every Yankee dentist in the South was now considered to be, working as an abolitionist, causing problems. Lots of lynchings went on at this time. Paranoia, fear. Every fire in every barn is set by some kind of saboteur or abolitionist. And so worst environment to go into a presidential election, but they happen by the calendar. You have to. Four-way race for president. You have Lincoln as the unified Northern Republican. Stephen Douglas breaks off from John Breckinridge running as a Northern Democrat versus Southern Democrat. When you do that, it just ensures Lincoln's going to win. Lincoln wins with a mere 39% of the vote, but he gets a majority in the Electoral College. And not an abolitionist, but he said, I'm going to strike at the heart of slavery in the West. We're going to try to abolish slavery there. And the South just decided they had enough. They were already behind the game in the Senate because so many free states had been added. They were behind in the House for quite some time. And they felt with the election of Lincoln, it was just a matter of time before enough states would, either through constitutional amendment or by legislation, free all the territory in the West of slavery and then strike at slavery in the South. Now, what's amazing is in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, most Southerners said, yeah, slavery will probably die out in 30 to 40 years and we're okay with that. By 1860, they said, no, that would be the worst thing in the world, and we won't allow it to happen. So they seceded. They left the Union. South Carolina leads the way, and it caused a chain reaction. 7 deep South states would leave the Union over this. They would hold these little election secession conventions, and they did it. South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, I think I mentioned Louisiana, and Texas, those 7 southern states, the deepest out, the states that have the highest concentration of slaves, they leave immediately. Lincoln hadn't even done anything yet. He doesn't take office till March 4th, but just the fact that he got elected, they said, peace out, we're gone. When Lincoln gets in there, just a few weeks afterwards, he had to deal with all the federal property that had been stolen, all the military bases and such. And so he decides to defend Fort Sumter. And when Fort Sumter is fired upon, a federal fort by South Carolina, by the Confederate States of America, the 4 upper South states decide to leave because there was hope that maybe the Civil War would be averted, tempers would calm, there'd be either a negotiated settlement or the South would be readmitted to the Union. Well, that's all dashed. And April 12th of 1861, when Fort Sumter is fired on, Lincoln calls up the reservists to put down the revolt. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee all seceded as well. They basically said, if there's going to be a war, we're on the side of the South. And so we have 11 Confederate states against the northern states now, and we have a civil war. We don't need to get into the specifics of the battles. It's a very complicated topic, and I got 3 minutes here. So here's what you need to know. Biggest issue in those opening months was the border states, the states where there's slavery exists, but it's a pretty small percentage of their population, right? South Carolina, the quintessential slavery state, 60% enslaved, 40% free. Kentucky, it's about 18% enslaved, 82% free. And that was the highest population of the border states. Missouri, it was only 15% enslaved. Delaware, it was 1%. Maryland, it's about 12, 13%. So these are weird states. You know, Maryland has this big city, Baltimore, that's a port city. It has factories, it has commerce, it has banks, but there's plantations in the southern part of Maryland. Same thing in Kentucky, like along the river in Kentucky, along Louisville, got commerce and steamships and banks and factories, but in the southern part, you have plantations. That's why Henry Clay was this amazing figure that was kind of from both sections. He was a banker, but he also owned slaves. You could kind of see both perspectives in this argument. So Lincoln, the genius, keeps all 4 of those border states in the Union, even creates a 5th. They carve West Virginia in half and create a 5th border state. Had those states gone to the Confederacy, probably they would have won, but Lincoln, the genius diplomat, kept them neutral. And then eventually they had to decide to join the North. And they did, which was incredible. Then you have the issue of emancipation. The war initially was about preserving the Union, but then it morphed into preserve the Union and free the slaves. And so what happens here is, for a number of reasons. Number one, we got to keep Europe out of the war, and they're likely to help the South as long as the South's just fighting for its independence. But if we are fighting to abolish slavery, Britain and France are going to stay neutral. Genius from Lincoln. Second, this would finally give meaning to the Civil War. Like, if the war ends tomorrow and Southerners get to keep their slaves, we're just going to keep having these arguments over the territories. If we end slavery, we don't have to argue about it anymore. And third, he wanted to protect the people that had already escaped, because the feeling was that there's some 250,000 former slaves in these refugee camps. When the war ends, they're all going to have to go back to their masters, and I can't allow that. So Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, changes the meaning of the war. And when the war is over, the slaves are free. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get in all the battles. The Civil War is fascinating, but through sheer determination, numbers, technology, the fact that the South was isolated in the diplomatic world, they didn't have any major factories, they had no banks, they just printed out money. The South would finally just get exhausted and lose, and the slaves were free. Lincoln is assassinated at the end of the war, and it's left to his successor, to Andrew Johnson, to try to make sense of all this and figure out, how to reconstruct the South. Okay, the 2 hours has elapsed. I didn't make as much progress as I had hoped, so that's okay. We'll, cover as much as we can next time, but I think that means we won't get all the way, like I hope, to like the 1980s and 1990s. I think we'll be lucky if we can make it, to World War II next time. That's my hope. 1865 to 1945. But we'll see, we'll try to progress. So keep reading, keep doing the reviews on your own. You'll have to supplement here. Thank you guys for coming out. I really appreciate it on a Saturday. I know that can't be fun. I'll drop the sign-in sheet into the chat one more time here. I don't know if this was informative to you, but you know, everybody wanted a content-based review, and I'm here to give that. I think we've done skills-based enough. You guys doing okay? The three of you that I can see? All right, cool, cool. All right, thank you guys. So if, again, if you did not sign in, please click on the link. I think it's the right link, right? It should take you to this. Yeah, I do see people on it. Just make sure you sign in. All you need to put is first name, last name, and period number. And wow, we had quite a few people, 32 today, about the same as before. But that's it. Enjoy your Memorial Day. Enjoy your weekend and study, study, study. And I'll see you guys again on Tuesday, okay? Thanks, guys. And bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Have a good
thank
weekend,
you.
Mr.
Bye.
Osborne.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.